Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining me today. My name is Mackenzie. I'm a digital accessibility specialist at Accessible Web, and welcome to this session on enhancing accessibility with a contrast checker. Today, we'll explore the importance of contrast in digital accessibility and how to effectively use a contrast checker. Ensuring proper contrast is crucial for users with visual impairments and is a key requirement under the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. We'll also take a look at what needs to be manually tested versus what can be detected in an automated scan. So contrast checkers are tools designed to measure contrast by sampling a selection of two colors on your screen and measuring the contrast ratio between them. Accessible Web provides a free contrast checking tool built into the RAMP Chrome extension. There are a few helpful checks built in to easily compare the contrast ratio to WCAG requirements. And later on, I'll provide a demonstration using this tool to manually test contrast on a web page. So the WCAG contrast ratio requirements ensure that text and UI components are readable and distinguishable. WCAG 2.2 defines multiple contrast-related criteria, such as text contrast, which defines normal text meeting a 4.5 to 1 contrast ratio against the background, and large text, which is 18 point or 14 point bold in the font size, as 3 to 1 contrast ratio. For non-text contrast, such as buttons, form controls, icons, interactive elements, um, these UI components and graphical elements require a 3 to 1 contrast ratio. There's also use of color. So this is for when uh, there's color that's not must not be the only means of conveying information. So that kind of means like links should be distinguishable beyond just color. So it has like a secondary affordance, like an underline. But if you use just color to distinguish a link between normal text, it requires a 3 to 1 contrast ratio against the surrounding text. So that's something else we have to check for. Um, and this is also part of the non-text contrast criteria, which was mentioned in an earlier slide. So the states of interactive elements, including the hover and focus indicators, must be clearly visible with a contrast ratio of at least 3 to 1 as well. So automatic scanning tools, such as the one built into RAMP, scan pages to identify static text and contrast issues. So static text contrast issues are those are similar to just text that when you hover or um, focus on them, that would be considered a state, but their default state would be their static text, and that's what it would be measured against. Um, and so, however, these automated tools have limitations and may not cover all accessibility issues. To fully test for contrast issues, manual testing is required. This is because automated scanners cannot fully detect all states and properties of the text and components on the page. So for text contrast, automated scanners may miss placeholder text, nested text components, and custom components. For UI components, there's buttons, form elements, and interactive components that need to be checked. Hover and focus states need to be checked, so changes in contrast during these must be tested manually, especially for changes in text contrast. Um, Interactive component states such as checked, selected, active, and default states also must meet a 3 to 1 contrast ratio. Meaningful images and graphics must have a 3 to 1 contrast ratio. So that could be things like if you see a bar chart with a pattern to sort of distinguish between different pieces of information on the bar chart, you might want to have you should have good contrast ratio so people can see the differences between the different patterns on screen. Focus indicators, like I was saying before, custom focus indicators must be visible with a 3 to 1 contrast ratio, and of course, use of color, ensuring that color is not only the only means of conveying information. So there's a difference between native components versus custom components. So when you create components that are native, they have the native focus indicator, which is whatever you set on your computer, on your phone, on your system, on your browser, and that will be dictated by your own preferences. So these native states, these native focus indicators are not required to be tested by for WCAG. However, if you're making custom components with custom focus indicators, these are the things that you have to look out for. These are the things that you have to test for. So now I'll demonstrate how to use the ramp contrast checker to manually test contrast on a web page. And this will provide sort of a practical look at how to ensure compliance with the WCAG contrast requirement. Cool. All right. So in the ramp extension, I'm going to just quickly load up the audit tool. I'm using a test site to demonstrate here today the contrast checker, which is also here. So this is what it looks like. In the contrast checker, we have a bunch of different components that are a part of it. We have the foreground and background color. These are to sort of determine the contrast ratio. And then here is those WCAG checks that I was talking about earlier. So let's go through the contrast requirements in the helper. So we have text contrast. This is the one I usually typically look for first. Actually, let's go back and take a look at the automated test first. So we can see what gets detected automatically when it comes up with this automatic failure. And it shows which elements on the screen do not meet these color contrast ratios. So immediately we can see that these three will be issues for meeting that 4.5 to 1 text contrast ratio. So let's go back to here. And we can double check, but I'm just doing this just to show everyone. So you can select the two colors, switch it around just to make sure that the background color versus foreground color is correct. And it shows that this is a 3 to 1 contrast ratio, which in this case does fail for WCAG AA requirements. And so that is something we would make a failure in. And in RAMP, we can do that here. And you can add the failure details. With the contrast checker, it does have this feature, which is a copy button to sort of copy the hex codes for the colors that you're testing. Let's continue down to the hover or focus text contrast. So this is a little bit different than testing for states. This is specifically for text contrast when you're testing for states. So let's focus on some of the elements in this on this page here. Now this site is purposely designed to be a bit broken. So eventually we will get to, there we go. Here we go. This is what we're looking for. So when you are on these elements, when you're focusing on these elements, the text contrast changes from 3 to 1 down to, I'm going to have to take a screenshot to measure this one because sometimes when focus states change, screenshots are required to sort of capture that moment. And we got the screenshot here. You can zoom in to help. And so the foreground color is now a 1.1 to 1 ratio, which is much worse. And so if that initially was conforming to, if this text was initially conforming to the 4.5 to 1 ratio, and then it became 1 to 1 or 1.1 to 1 ratio, then it would fail this criteria as well. We'll continue on with the UI components. So these are components on the page that are not text-based. So these can be like drop-down menus. This can be form elements. So let's take a look at the Contact Us page if there's anything on here. So I can tell right away that these are not using the default focus indicator because a bit of a pro tip here, I've changed my my default focus indicator for my system to be purple. So I can immediately tell right away which one is custom and which one is default. But if you can see here, these elements do not conform to the correct color contrast ratio. We can test for that as well. But basically, because this element is against the background here, a 1-to-1, nearly a 1-to-1 contrast ratio, it might be hard to distinguish this element with somebody who has low vision. So this is something you got to kind of look for, and the same with the focus and hover states. But here's the interesting thing. So in this instance, because there is a indicator for where you're typing, that actually counts as the conforming focus state. So because this is basically black on white, this should get a very high contrast ratio, which means that because of this one indicator, this whole component is conforming to the state's requirement for that, which is 3-to-1. So another thing we have to check for, like I said, was the placeholder text. And what we're looking for is trying to find the darkest portion of that text here, and then measuring it against the background. Looks like that placeholder text is conforming because it meets that 4.5-to-1 contrast ratio. In the state section, we're also going to check for the focus indicators for other elements outside of the form elements. I'm going to go back to the home page. Yeah, here's another great example of that. When you focus on something, it becomes no longer contrast conforming. So this is the default focus indicator. We don't need a test for that, but this one we should test for. Again, we can screenshot. It takes a little bit for it to load. Here we go. So we can test that against the background. Now this focus indicator is a little tricky, and it's something I would fail for because this outer border doesn't meet a 3-to-1 contrast ratio. And normally when the border or there's a secondary affordance that changes, sort of like an underline or something, when you focus on it, that can be considered conforming. But because to some people, this border that appears would not be visible, I would consider that failing in my books. And yeah, let's go through the last one here. We got the non-text contrast for graphics. And this is for things like bar charts or infographics or things that show important items that are not necessarily text-based, but you require to see these kind of things to understand the meaning behind what you're trying to convey. These icons and these standalone icons must meet a 3-to-1 contrast ratio. So something like this would be considered part of that because it has no sort of text associated with that says email or anything. So we can check that to see if it's contrast conforming. And it looks like it's not. So then you would add a failure to make sure that it's addressed by the development team or by yourself and make sure it's conforming in that way. All right. So that's the demonstration. Sorry if that took a little bit of time, but yeah. So contrast is a key component of digital accessibility, while automated tools help identify some issues. Manual testing is essential for good conformance, and using tools like the ramp contrast checker can make it easy to maintain accessibility standards and improve usability for all.